Well, thank you for being here this morning. Rob, do you need this? They're all right. Thank you for being here this morning. I appreciate it. If you want to open up your Bible to John chapter 9, before I get started, especially those of you who are visiting with us, and not just visitors, but you are visitors, but if you're family members, visiting family, I know you're technically visiting with us, but you're kind of a different category. If you're family of our family, then you're our family, and so we're glad to see you. I'm sure everybody got that. It made perfect sense. That's good. It's good to see everybody here this morning. I'm glad to see you all. I'm not going to do a standard New Year's Eve lesson, which I don't know what your thoughts are about that, but I think for most of the years that I've been preaching New Year's Eve, I like to evaluate where I've been, and I like to think about where I'm going, and so New Year's Eve is one of those things that's kind of right up my alley to think about, okay, what's the next couple days going to look like? Maybe not the next year, but the next couple days anyway. What's that going to look like for me? And I did John chapter 9 last Sunday, which means that it's been a couple Sundays ago that I did my prep work and my reading to get ready for John chapter 9, and I'm ready to move into John chapter 10. But there's something that stuck in my mind. I'm going to read something to you near the end of this lesson. There's a quote that I think I'm like 99% sure I'm going to write in the margin of my Bible. But that quote, once we get there, I hope that you will appreciate, is one of those things that'll make you tap the brakes just a little bit and think. And I'll even say this. I think it's better. I think the world is better if everybody just opens up and I say what I'm thinking and you say what you're thinking, and we can do that in a kind way. But, the closed doors, we don't really know each other thing doesn't work for me. So I will at least start with this, because I don't think that I can on today, but partly I don't want to just open the doors wide open. And maybe you will understand that, but I'm going to go backwards to the scripture reading. And I want to tell you why this passage especially is something that I can't move past. I'm ready for John chapter 10, but these 3 verses are something that I read, and I read that quote especially, and I think we have to talk about that specifically. And, when something goes wonky in a pregnancy and things don't happen and turn out exactly the way that you were expecting and hoping them to happen and turn out, the end of that road, these verses all of a sudden jump off the page a little bit more than they used to. Whenever you see a group of disciples walking past a man who was born with a disability, in this case he's blind, and their question is why? That's the thing that I think I'm ready to be done with my open doors for right now. We can close those doors back up. But especially, if you're asking the question, why is this the way that it is? This man was born blind. Is it because he did something wrong to bring it upon himself? Or this is another one. This is where I'm like, not only going to close the doors, maybe just lock the doors up a little bit extra tight on this one. I think especially if you're a mama in this situation, the question pops up over and over again, did I do something to create this situation? Is this my fault or my doing? And so you're reading through chapter 9 and you're saying, okay, what's the message here? And these 3 verses just won't let me go. You know what I'm saying? they throw a lasso out around my brain, and I can't hardly think about anything else. And so that's why I'm here today. There is a New Year's resolution type thought at the end of this lesson, and it's not just a contrived hokey gimmick because it's New Year's Eve. It really is something about maybe as we move forward in 2024, here's something that we can all do. But I would like for us to just dwell on these 3 verses, and I would like for you, I wish that you could see, I mean you can, I can email them if you want them. My notes are organized. I have points. I think there's like 4 main points in this lesson. But this lesson, even though it is organized, this lesson really happens with, this is like the rambliest thing that I think I've ever put down on paper, because I'm just thinking through. I'm reading this text, and it's like a river, and the text is just pulling me down my thought stream. And so I'll try to be as organized as I can with you and tell you where the points are. But let's this morning, if we can do such a thing, if this makes any sense, let's just talk. Let's just go back and forth with each other on this. And so let's read it again. Verse 1, as he passed by, this is Jesus. Passing by, he sees a man who was blind from birth, and his disciples also see this person, and they have the same question that I can almost guarantee every single person in this room has asked or will ask at some point in their life when hurt and suffering in the world happen. Why is that? And it's not just why, but this is kind of one of those natural things that people do. We don't want to say, why is that? We want to say, whose fault is it? Who can I blame for this problem that created this? And they see this man who was born blind, and they ask him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And I'm just going to stop there for a few minutes, and I'm going to think about the problem of evil. I'm going to say this. This is point number 1, okay? First of all, my first reaction to John chapter 9 and verse 2, hey, look, there's a man with a disability. Who messed up to create that problem? My first reaction is going to be something like, you best watch your mouth. But here's the thing. It's not wrong thinking. I really get defensive about that question. Why did this thing happen? Who caused it? Who did something wrong to lead to this end result? And I'm just, like, I'm rolling up my sleeves and I'm ready to fight right now, depending on who you ask that question to. But if you're going to stop and take a breath, it's not wrong, because all hurt and suffering and evil in this world is the result of sin. It's true. I mean, this is not just a completely misguided thought that they say, who messed up to create this problem? And so for those of you who may not be aware of this is the way that you lay out the problem of evil. And I don't throw this problem of evil up on the board lightly. In my opinion, that problem of evil is the number 1 hardest question to overcome as far as Christianity is concerned. It's the number 1 reason why people lose their faith or refuse to come to the faith, is because bad things in the world. And the problem of evil is something like this. I say, my understanding of the scriptures is that God is both all good and all loving and all powerful, but undeniably there is evil and suffering and hurt in the world. So there's your math equation, and the math equation doesn't work. That God is all good and God is all powerful, but there's suffering and evil in the world. And the reason why the math equation doesn't work is because, as some people would say, if God is all good, then he would not let there be suffering and evil in the world. If you are an all-good, all-loving being, as I say that I believe that God is, then how can you reconcile an all-good God with a whole lot of hurt that you see in the world around us or in our own lives right now? Or maybe that one you can get past, go to the all-powerful. Or he's not all-powerful, because if he is all-good, he must not be able to overcome evil and suffering in the world. That's a power problem. He doesn't have the ability. And my view of God that I read about in the scriptures is that he is all-powerful to do anything he wants. And so I'd say, well, he is all-powerful. And you say, then he's not all good because he doesn't fix it. And I say, no, he is all good. Then he's not all-powerful. Or he would fix it. That's the problem of evil. I'm on point number 1 right now. I told you it's kind of rambly, but stick with me here. Point number 1. Point number 1 is like that meme. Have you ever seen the meme where there's a guy riding a bicycle and he takes a stick, and the guy on the bike takes the stick and rams it into his spokes? And if you were a boy who grew up, in the 80s and the 90s like me, you've seen this firsthand, how this sort of thing works. But you take a stick, you run it through the spokes, and the stick comes up, and it gets caught on the fork, and the bike goes like this. And the funny thing about that meme is that's something that you do to your friends. You put the stick into the spokes, and you watch them fly over the handlebars. But in the meme, it's a guy who's riding a bike, and he takes the stick, and he puts it through the spokes, and then he's laying on the ground, and he blames somebody. He says, why did you do this to me? That's what the problem of evil is to me. The problem of evil is not a God problem. The problem of evil is a me problem. And the way that you see that is in the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 1, if you just read through Genesis chapter 1, 7 times it says that what God did and what God created was good. It was good, 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 good. And then the 7th time says, and it was all very good. Everything that God did was good. And he put a tree in the middle of the garden, and he told Adam and Eve, don't eat from that tree. And we're going to speed the story up here just a little bit, but the short version is they listened to the snake and they ate from the tree. And because they chose to disobey God, they ruined his good and perfect creation. And so now comes the punishment and the curses, and all evil and all suffering is going to start right there at that spot. And we don't get to say, as individuals, well, thanks a lot, Adam and Eve. You left me a great world with hurricanes and tornadoes and, birth defects and all kinds of problems. I don't get to point my finger at Adam and Eve and say, thanks a lot for giving me those bad things, because guess what? I've done the exact same thing. God has given me the set of rules and instructions that I knew perfectly well existed, and I chose to eat the fruit in spite of knowing that it's wrong. And not only have I done the same sin, and you have too, not only have we done the same sin that Adam and Eve did, not only that, every person in this room has been the source of another person's suffering. We've all hurt other people. Maybe it wasn't intentional, but we have. Maybe with our words, maybe with our physical actions, whatever. We've all been the source of somebody else's suffering at some point in this life. And so when I'm looking at the problem of evil, and I'm listening to people around me who just lament and they cry, and I'm not making fun of this because I do too. And you look at the world and you say, why? Why would God do such a thing? Why would God allow such a thing? I'm not going to follow a God who does something like that. I'm not going to believe in a God who behaves in such a way because I don't agree with what God does. A person who thinks like that and talks like that is the guy riding a bike who sticks a stick in his own spokes and lands on the ground and says, "Why did you do this to me, God? This is your fault." No, it's not. It's my fault. It's all of our faults because we've all chosen to listen to the lies of the snake and to eat the forbidden fruit, and we've all participated in the sin that ultimately is the cause of all suffering and evil in this world. And so here's something that a rabbi has said a long time ago in history. There is no death without sin, and there is no suffering without iniquity. And so that's point number one, where I'm going to hold off on being mad at the disciples for asking, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? I'm not just going to go full scale mad at those guys, because they are at least a little bit right, that man being born blind is the result of sin. It's true. That part is true. I'm not saying that it's his sin. I'm not even saying that it's his parents' sin, but all suffering and all evil is the result of sin. And so that's at least one thing that we need to consider. Let's think about how sin sometimes is the direct result of a person's, that evil and suffering sometimes is the direct result of a person's sin. So they asked this man, hey, you were born blind. What did you do to deserve it? And my reaction would be something like, how dare you ask something like that? But that's not an unreasonable question either. Go back to John chapter 5. In John chapter 5, there was a man who was lame, laying at the pool. That means his legs couldn't work. Sometimes we would say that this guy is paralyzed. Let's read John chapter 5. I think I want to start in verse 3. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. And one man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him laying there, this is the short version, we're going to speed this up again. Jesus ultimately heals the man, and now he's able to walk for the first time in 38 years, and he goes home and he's healed. And if you read this story, he's not a nice man. He throws Jesus right under the bus. You would think that if Jesus did something like that for you, you would respond appropriately. He does not. But Jesus runs into him later in verse 14. And when we were at this part of our text in the Gospel of John, I mentioned this to you. In John chapter 5 and verse 14, Jesus found this man in the temple, and he said to him, "Look, you're well. Sin no more, that nothing worse will happen to you." And my take on those words are that this man did do something to create his problem. I don't know what he did. Let's just imagine something like a drunk driver. You choose to sin, you get behind the wheel of a car drunk, you get in an accident, and now your legs don't work anymore. Who's to blame for that? I'm to blame for that. That's my fault. That's the direct consequence of my sin. And so Jesus comes to this man, and the end result in this conversation is, don't sin again, and if you do, something worse is going to happen. Now, you don't have to take the same understanding of that verse that I do, but go to 1 Corinthians 11. There is another one that I do want you to see. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, in verses 29 through 30, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 in verses 29 and 30, here Paul is talking to the Corinthians about Lord's Supper things, and they're not doing the Lord's Supper the way that they're supposed to, and he says, come on guys, this is how we do it the right way. And this is the end of that conversation. 1 Corinthians 11 verses 29 and 30, for anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body, eats and drinks judgment on himself. Listen to this. That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. Now, I don't know what that means. I don't know what that looks like or practically how it worked out. But what Paul is saying to the Corinthians is, you all have messed up along the way, and some of you are suffering the consequences of those bad decisions that you've made, sinful decisions along the way. And so this question about the blind man, why is he suffering? Did he do something to deserve it? It's not completely off the table. I'll mention a part about how he was born blind in just a second, because that's probably where your minds go. But I would give you an example. I did the drunk driver example a minute ago. I heard somebody do this the other day. Pause in the sermon. Somebody mentioned AIDS, HIV and AIDS the other day. And somebody's response to that, it might have been one of my kids, I don't remember. Somebody's response to that was, wow, that's retro. You know, those of us who grew up in the 80s and the 90s, like HIV and AIDS is a conversation. It's a part of our lives. We talk about this a lot. And so you think about HIV and AIDS, and I looked at Bard. Bard is the Google version of ChatGPT, and I said, give me some stats. As of 2001, 67% of new cases of HIV and AIDS are connected with male-to-male sexual contact, and 8% of new cases are connected to sharing needles, drug needles, injection needles. That's 75% total. 75% of all new cases of HIV and AIDS are the direct result of sinful behavior. I do something sinful and wrong, and now I'm going to pay the consequences for doing that thing. That's the best example that I can do. And so you look at a person, who looks at the HIV/AIDS crisis. I think it's still a crisis. I grew up with it being a crisis. I think it's still a crisis. You look at somebody and they say, "Why would God let something like this happen?" That's not a God problem. At least 75% of the time, that's a me problem. That's a sin problem. It's a direct result of the choice that I make. And one last thing, rambling about this thing, sometimes suffering is the direct result of sin. How are we going to say that with the guy who's born blind? I'm going to go back to John chapter 9, and I'm going to go down to verse 34. It's not just the disciples who think that. When the Pharisees get to the end of their rope with this guy, this is their accusation too in verse 34. You were born in utter sin. They blame him. Why is this person experiencing this suffering and this evil in the world? And some of the people are saying, well, he did something to deserve it. He did something wrong. Now, I think that's ridiculous, that a baby in the womb can sin and do something wrong. But I will just throw this out there. Before you just jump off the cliff and say, well, that's ridiculous, nobody believes that, there's a pretty huge chunk of Christianity who say that babies are born with sin, that they're born with their own sin and their own guilt as they come into the world. And so, I'm not sure how you get there, but it's not an unreasonable thing that somebody gets there. Lots of people do. Okay, let's talk about this. Maybe it's someone else's fault. Who sinned? This man or his parents that he be born blind? Whose fault is it? Maybe it's their fault. And you would say, I'm going to go to Exodus 20 right now. You would say to a parent in this situation, you can't blame yourself. This is not your fault. It's not reasonable. But you know what? That's not entirely right either. Sometimes it is the parent's fault. Or maybe we're not just thinking about the birth process. I'm just thinking about why is there suffering and evil in the world. Don't say maybe it's my parents' fault. You could say it could just be somebody else's fault who inflicted that evil and suffering on me. I'm looking at Exodus chapter 20. And the second command that starts in verse 4, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above or in the earth beneath or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Listen, visiting the iniquity of the fathers, the sin. The fathers chose to depart from God and to do this thing. And God says, I'm going to visit that sin of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. And so it's not completely unreasonable. This is just the world that we live in. Sometimes parents make bad decisions and their kids suffer because of it. That's the way it goes. I think in Joshua chapter 7, the story of Achan is a really great example of that. Do you remember how God said, don't take any of the spoil from the city of Jericho? And Achan decided, I'm not going to listen to God, I'm going to do it anyway. And they finally bullseye narrowed in on Achan and they say, you're the guy. And at the end of that story, Achan was not the only one who got put to death because of his sin. His whole family and even all of his animals suffered because of him. Sometimes people suffer because of other people's sin. So there's that. I'm going back to the HIV/AIDS thing. I saw this on my Bard search. Man, this one will hurt you. 75% of all new cases of HIV and AIDS are either from male-to-male homosexuality or sharing needles. 3% though, listen, I'm going to read this. It came straight from Bard. This will just tear you up. This ruined my day. During pregnancy, childbirth, or breastfeeding, an HIV-positive mother can pass the virus to her child. So there's an example of the kid didn't do anything wrong. He's suffering the consequences of the sin of the parent. So why? Why do bad things happen? Who can I blame for this? These are the ramblings of a person who's tried to figure this out. I'm like the disciples. I want to know. What's the cause? Who's to blame? Am I responsible? Did I do something to create this problem? I want to know the answers to those questions. I'll point you real quick to Luke chapter 13. Jesus did have something to say about this in Luke chapter 13. Jesus is trying to walk his disciples down this thought path and say, not all suffering is the direct result of somebody's sin. It's not like people who suffer more sin more, and they deserve it more. And so he tells this story in Luke chapter 13 and verse 1. He says, there were some present at that very time who told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifice. And so here you have a group, I assume they're religious people, going to God for right reasons to offer sacrifice, and Pilate kills them for it. And Jesus' response in verse 2 is he says, do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered in this way? Are we going to look at those guys and say, because they died this horrible fate and somebody did this thing to them, are we going to say that they're worse sinners and that they deserved it and everybody else who lived was not that big of a sinner and they didn't deserve it? And the implication of what Jesus is saying is, no, that's not how it works. If you keep on going, there's another one. Well, he says in verse 3, no, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. Verse 4, or those 18 on whom the tower in Siloam fell and killed them, do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others who lived in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. And so I'm just working through this, All suffering is the result of sin. Sometimes my suffering is the direct result of my sin. Sometimes my suffering is the direct result of somebody else's sin, but not always, And so there's something for you to work through. Point number 4. This is the end of the lesson. And this is the part that roped my heart and grabbed my attention. If you've been if you zoned out a long time ago and this is not the kind of stuff you want to think about, come back to me now. Because this is the part that I want you to see more than anything else. And if you have a marker in John chapter 9, you might want to go back there and read it with me, because we're asking these questions. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he be born blind? And I don't know that I've ever noticed what Jesus does in his answer here. The way that Jesus takes these questions and these situations and exactly what he does with it. Look at verse 3, how Jesus answers them. Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents." Okay, we answered the question. It's not his fault, it's not his parents' fault. But look at this. It's not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. So here's the quote. Here's the quote that is the reason for this sermon. The thing that I read in a commentary that made me think, oh man. And I'm going to take this quote and I'm going to write this in the margin of my Bible here, next to this section. This is from Raymond Brown. He says, Jesus was asked about the cause of the man's blindness. Jesus was asked about the cause of the man's blindness, but he answers in terms of its purpose. In other words, Jesus is not so interested in answering why it's happening in the first place or whose fault it is. Jesus is more interested in answering what's it going to lead to? What's it ultimately going to produce? And specifically in this situation, and he heals the man, and people see the miraculous healing, and cool, that's great. And so what Jesus says is, what's going to happen is, you're going to watch me heal this man's blindness, and people are going to glorify God because of it. This is not a thing that's just completely foreign to the Gospel of John. Look over at John chapter 11 and verse 4. This is the story where a man has died, and people are saying to him, Jesus, if you would have just been here sooner, you could have solved this problem and we would not have to go through all of this suffering because of death. And listen to Jesus' response in John chapter 11 and verse 4. Jesus says, this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. That's the exact same thing that we're looking at right now. Jesus doesn't focus on the what or the why or the who's to blame. He says, what's going to come from it? It's not the cause, it's the purpose. What's the purpose of this suffering right now? And that, again, I'll do the thing. We're just going to crack the door of my heart for just a little bit. If you're the parent of a kid who hears an uh-oh in your pregnancy appointment, to hear these words that it's not about the cause, it's about the purpose, is something that'll make you stop for 1 second and say, well, what is the purpose? Where is this thing going to lead? And what is it going to produce in the end? And so here is my last main takeaway that I'd ask you to think about. That last question, what is it going to produce and what is it going to lead to, that is entirely up to us. Whether or not God will be glorified in this situation, or everybody's just going to get to hear me complain about God because of what he did to me. There's one last thing. I'll just do one last thing. I promise this is the last thing. Oh, I got to click here for you so you can see the end part. It was not that this man sinned or the parents that. This is the last thing that I want you to see. I'm going to zoom in here on that last thing. This is the purpose that Jesus is pointing to. It says that the works of God might be displayed in him. Take those words. Why is this thing happening? What's the purpose of it? That the works of God might be displayed in him. And there is a verse in the Gospel of John that tells us what the works of God are. Go over to John chapter 6 and verses 27 through 29. John chapter 6 and verses 27 to 29, Jesus is trying to explain to people that following me is not all about me filling your bellies or doing great things for you. This is the bread of life conversation. In verse 27, John chapter 6 and verse 27, Jesus says, "Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you, for on him God the Father has set his seal." And then they said to him, "What must we do to be doing the works of God?" Remember, I'm at this question. Jesus said, what's the purpose of this man and his blindness and what's about to happen? That the works of God might be displayed in him. And these guys are asking, what are the works of God? What do I need to be doing the works of God? Verse 30, read it with me. Oh, verse 29. Jesus answered them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." And so if you just want to take all of these pieces of the puzzle that are floating around out there right now in this conversation, I'm not going to think about the causes or the blames of suffering and evil in this world. I'm not going to think about the cause. I'm going to think about the purpose, that the works of God might be seen. And we're going to put it all together in this little package. So what is the work of God that can be seen in blindness or in other disabilities or other hurt and suffering? That you put your faith in Jesus and hang on to that faith in such a way that nothing can cause you to turn loose. That's the work of God that comes from suffering and evil. Everything in this lesson leads to this one spot. What do I do when it's my turn to suffer and to endure evil and hurt, whether it's my fault or not? To put my faith in Jesus and to hold on so tight that everybody in the world can't see but where my hope and where my trust is. That's the work of God that comes from all hurt and evil and suffering. And so I told you there's a New Year's resolution at the end of this lesson as we move into 2024. And as is, almost guaranteed to happen in the next 365 days, something bad will happen in your life. I hope it's not catastrophic, but something bad will happen. There will be some hurt and some evil. And when that time comes, my question is not, why do bad things happen? Why is there suffering in the world? Whose fault is this problem? What did I do to deserve it? What did my parents do to put me in this bad situation? Rather, when it's my turn to suffer and hurt in the next 365 days, my response is going to be something like this. How am I going to glorify God in this situation? How am I going to see the work of God, me putting my faith and my trust and my hope in Jesus? How is that going to lead to you and everyone else looking at me saying, "To God be the glory because of this"? That's going to be a good resolution that you can start working on and thinking about now. All right, thank you for entertaining my what I would call ramblings about the problem of evil. I hope that it's useful for you at some point. I hope you don't need it, but I hope that it's useful. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, I know that the problem of evil is often the number one reason that keeps people from coming to Jesus and handing their life over to him. They say, I don't want to serve a God who would let such a thing happen. But if you're here this morning and you've been thinking through these things and you're tracking, I think, in a biblical way with what I've been talking about, your response can be something like this. You know what? There is a lot of suffering and evil in this world, and instead of rejecting God because of it, I'm going to go to the one who ultimately is the solution for all these problems. That solution might not be here and now in this life, but he is the solution. Maybe in the life to come, good enough for me. If you know what you need to do and you're ready to do it, come forward and let me know as we stand and sing the invitation song.